Good evening, PLO order. Welcome to another video. This time topic is probe betting. And probe betting means we bet the turn when opponent has missed his cbet. So let's get started and let's put the hologram on. Hello. Probe betting. We are out of position, so I think it's important to clarify what the probe bet is. So we get that right. So we are out of position, and now it's a heads-up pot, single raised, and opponent checks instead of cbet. So the opponent is in position, so we have called out of position. Very often that means we are on the blinds. Quite rare that we would be calling pre-flop out of position unless we are on the blinds. But yeah, so the opponent checks back, and then we bet the turn. That's a probe bet. And it's often a situation that people don't focus too much. So I'm going to open up a few things that we need to think about when we are probe betting. Average fold to probe bet is around 50%. So I check my databases, and it's around that 48, 49, 50, 51, depending slightly on the sides and so on. So on average, it's around 50. Now, what this number tells us, not much, because there's high variety. Some people fold a lot to probe bets, and some people fold not that much to probe bets, but the average is around 50. But it tells you that if we bet pot on the turn, as a bluff, we need 50% fold equity to be break even. So on average, if we bet less than pot on the turns, then on average, that is profitable for us in the long run, slightly. So it means that even if we probe bet a decent amount of times, it necessarily doesn't mean we're going to lose a lot of money. And average fold to river barrel is around 50%. So if we bet the turn and barrel river, average fold equity that the opponent folds before showdown goes up to 75, which is quite a lot. Of course, we risk a lot of money. But it just shows that people don't defend very heavily versus ropes and barrels. But it's very open and dependable. So about the thinking process, first section is questions. Now, this is something I haven't been opening too much, but it's about how I approach poker and how, in my mind, we should make decisions. And in poker, we want to ask the right questions. First thing is that you have to learn to ask questions, because poker is a game of information, and especially imperfect information. We don't know everything. We have to estimate things, but there are things we know. And on average, in poker hand, there's a lot of information out there. Especially if you have HUD, you have loads of numbers, we have notes, we have our own experiences, sizings, timings, sports, everything. There's a lot of information that our brain picks out. And then in good decision making, first, we know the crucial information, so we process from all the information what we need. Like, if we talk about flop situation, then check raise river stat is probably not that relevant. So we pick up the relevant information and then use it. And as we are not computers, then the way to help is to ask the right questions. So often in a hand, there is going to be that one question that if you can answer that question, the answer tells you how to play your hand. But what is the crucial question? That's always the big thing. So very often, when opponent checks the flop instead of c-betting, the first question should be, what is his checkback range? Can we make any assumptions? Does it cap his range? Does it not cap his range? How often he c-bets? Like if he normally c-bets 80% of times in heads up, but suddenly he checks back, Is it a trap? Is it a weak hand? What kind of board it is? What's my range? Is this the flop that he would check back often? Is this a flop he should check back only a few times and see, but with high frequency he's not? And does he understand balance strategy? Does he implement that? So the question is simple, what is his check back range? But to answer, whole new ballgame and lots of information and estimations to be made. Then once the flop goes check check and we get to the turn, how does the turn interact with that range? That's the first question. If we can define his range on the flop, then we have to figure out, okay, does the turn, how much it helps him, how much it's a scare card for him, how much it improves my hand, or how much it improves my perceived range. Those are two different things. And then what's my hand? What's my blocker? So what do I have here to work with? And all of that is combined and processed in your head. And then you probably get the answer. Do we bet the turn or not? So easy question, simple answer, everything in between. That's where things get complicated. And there's no, I would say that there's no easy rule of thumbs, easy ways to figure out, because two situations that might look quite similar to outside are two totally different things based on opponent, our hand, and everything. But I think those are also the most fun spots, because you really have to use your brain. You can't autopilot probe bet situations. Check back. Now the thing is, when opponent decides to check back instead of cbet, then there's wide variety in their check back strategy. Some people have more balanced check back strategy and they check back on certain boards most of their range, even strong hands. So it's one way to approach that they play the board with their whole range instead of their actual hand. Then there are people who always play their actual hand. And then there are people who just want to see bet a lot. And then there are people who only bet with really strong hands. And that's the thing is, the average check back frequency might be 50% probably, but there's a really wide variety on what kind of strategy people have for the check back. And the thing is that if you get any notes and information, all of that equals money. But good start if you have the hand is cbet flop, or if there's some kind of stats on the software. So that's a good indication. If someone cbets a lot, then the check back range is, the check back itself is very defining strategy. But if someone cbets only 30% overall, then his check back doesn't define that much his range. So it's a good start to figure out what he would bet, how often he would bet. And without hard notes, make notes, make notes, make notes. When someone checks back, hand goes to showdown, you can probably see what he checked back. Is there a good logical reason? What is it? Make a note, and so on. And in general, now this is very general. Regular players, tight aggressive players, cbet often in heads up pots. So when you get heads up, they're in position. What I've seen that most regulars cbet way more than, let's say, solver would indicate. Their cbetting range is not polarized. They cbet also mediocre hands, weak made hands, semi-strong hands, and so on. So very often, a lot of regulars cbet unless they know why they would check back. Of course, that's the kind of strategy that I often teach to beginners because it's easy to implement and get started. But a lot of people have that same kind of strategy. So in general, of course, there's a wide variety. And combined from that is, if you're totally readless, then very often when people check back instead of cbetting the flop, especially in position, then it's often a mediocre hand. Very often the check back caps their range. I mean, there aren't that many players who would check back really strong hands to trap you. That often should come from certain dynamics when you also have a lot of reads on your opponent, but relatively for random players, not many people start to slow play strong hands unless it's like quads and so on. So very often, especially on dynamic boards, when they check back, it caps their range. Now, another thing to think about is the blockers. Every time an opponent checks back, if we always attack the turn with really high frequency, like every time when he checks the turn, we just stab the turn. There's actually a lot of players, a lot of regulars who do that. And it's very transparent because you can see that, okay, they don't hit the flops that often. And then you just start to fight back and you can make a lot of money versus those who stab very often when you check back the flop. So we don't want to be that guy unless the opponent just folds. If opponent keeps folding after flop check, then by all means you can bet even 100% of turns if opponent folds 90% of turns. But often if your aggression goes heavily up on the turns once they check the flop, it's very transparent and they should see it and they should adjust some way. So we don't want to be advocating always, but we don't want to play pure value poker either. So once again, as usual in Omaha, we use our hand to make the decision. No random number generators, no that kind of stuff. It's our hand, 4 cards. And we can have blockers to opponent's calling range. That is good if we make bluffs. It increases the fold equity. We could have blockers that we want to barrel river. So we might have certain flush blocker, so we can represent the flush on the river. On the turn, we could bet with straight blockers and barrel blank rivers, and so on. And then we can have blockers to the opponent's bluffing range. Especially when we have a made hand and we bluff, we block the bluffing range. We could try to then decide, should we check or should we bet for value? And it is, if we don't have blockers to bluffing range and we have a value hand, we could think about checking twice, because then he might bluff us slightly more than if we did have blockers to bluffing range. Pretty much those blockers or unblockers to bluffing range, they are more about when we decide, do we bet or check when we have value hands. But I just decided to include it in here to show that there's all kinds of blockers. So then when we bet the turn, I make it very black and white here. We either have a value hand or we have a bluffing hand. And often if we use a protection bet, it's the bottom of our value range. But let's make it very black and white, values and bluffs. When we have a value hand, which means that we have a strong hand, it's a hand that we would like to make the pot bigger, then prop bet should be standard. Like if we're just clicking buttons and autoplaying without thinking, we're tired or watching movie at the same time. When we hit the flop strong, opponent checks back, we have a strong hand on the turn, the bet should be standard strategy. And to deviate from that, we need information. Don't slow play strong hands twice without good reads. Like if we hit the top set, we go for check raise, opponent checks back, turn is a blank, bet yourself. Don't try to check raise again, because often what happens, you get to the river and you flop the nuts and get 0 value, or you check the river, you check 3 times with nuts, and that's not probably the best line. The thing is that on average, opponents, when you check twice, the average bet is around 42% only. So if you think that, okay, when I check twice, the opponent should bet. That's the old poker truth. I once had a mouse pad that said that if opponent checks twice, bet. It was old rules of Hold'em. But yeah, it seems that it's not the case. In heads-up pots, when you check twice and the pre-flop raiser has checked back the flop, they only attack the turn 42% of times. So it doesn't mean that when you check twice, people go crazy. There are people who go crazy, but on average, very often, they check back turn more often than they bet. And if you have a strong hand, you are blocking their value range. So I would say that if you have a strong hand, the number goes down. And then most opponents don't have a plan versus prop bets. So when you make the prop bet, they often start to think, oh, what should I do? So when they check back the flop, most of your opponents don't have a plan that, okay, I'm checking back the flop, it captures my range, I understand that on certain turns I will call, on certain turns I will fold, on certain turns I might raise. If opponent checks twice, these are the turns I bet. Most opponents don't have that plan. They play one street poker. So on the flop they see that, okay, my hand is not really strong, let's see the turn. And on the turn when you bet, they are, okay, he bets, what does this mean? And they start the thinking process there. So it's good to understand that they are not masterminds who are making complicated strategies versus you. They live in the moment. And when you have certain and good bluffs, they are quite valuable, especially versus certain types of opponents. And now the thing is to figure out what are the good spots to bluff. And before we go to the hand, I'm actually going to, this is bad video making. I'm going to answer a message without pausing the video, because if I pause the video, then I have to do more work when editing it, and I'm a lazy bastard. So I'm just going to answer here. I can't pause this recording software, so just a second before we go to the hands. It's urgent. So let's get to the hands. And I got few 5 hands. And let's see what we have and discuss about whether the line is good and what should we be thinking about here. It's a 3-bet pot. We are 150 bps, 160 bps deep. And we call. And well, yeah, in 3-bet pots, we actually can be out of position from other positions. And normally I wouldn't put 3-bet pots here, but I put this one. You could think it's also a single raised pot and we are on the blinds. Doesn't really matter. The same principle applies here. Thing is that when he checks back the flop, it would be really weird if he had a straight. The difference is here, if the board is rainbow, then 6-8 you can easily check back. There aren't that many scary turns. Not sure if you should, but you could. But when there's a flush draw, very often made hands need to protect the hand and they will bet the flop. And then turn is a blank, 6-8 is still the nuts. We have the 8 blocker. And we also have a queen blocker for the flush, so we have pretty nice blockers. We also have the open-ender as an additional equity if he decides to close. So we have a lot of good things going on with the hand. So we decide to bet the turn represent 6-8. It would make sense. And opponent just folds. The thing is now, if opponent calls and turn is a blank, then we could fire, let's say the turn is 2 of spades. We could definitely just fire the river. Because when he calls the turn, it's very unlikely that he has even a decently strong straight. If he calls a turn, very often he has the flush draw, could have a set. A lot of hands that should fold to a blank river. Not sure if they would, but they should. So when they check back the flop on sort of dynamic board, it caps their range. And versus this capped range, we have the 8 blocker, which is nice. We have the 10-8, additional equity, and we even have the flush blocker. So good blockers in the hand for us. Then let's take the second one. I would like to defend this if we had a suited ace. Now I don't have heart here, but seems a bit weak hand to defend on the big blind unless opponent is very specific. But we're not talking about pre-flop here. But we do get to the flop. Let's assume that we have the suited ace. So it's like ace of diamonds, if it makes everyone comfortable us playing with this hand. We check, opponent checks back. Once again, if the board was rainbow, then he could have a set of kings because there's no square cards on the turn. For set of kings, whatever the turn is, he still has the nuts pretty much because we don't 3-bet pre-flop. But when there's a flush draw, even set of kings would want to bet here. Get value from flush draws protecting. When he checks back now, if taps the range to mediocre hands, could be naked flush draw. Well, we have the ace of spades here, which is great. Could be a weak king. And so on. We do have the 7, which is also kind of interesting because it takes away 7 deuce of 2 pairs. And now when the king comes, every time when the board pairs, the chance of him having a king goes down. He can have king, but it's like us having a king blocker. The chance of him having a king goes down a lot. And we do have the 7. We might actually have the best hand here. So why not stab the turn when top card pairs? Very often top card pairing is good to pro bet because people cbet top pair very often. I mean, without reading this, I pretty much assume that top pair is cbet. But if I see checking back top pair, it's often worth making note even. And opponent just folds. If he calls a turn, especially when we have ace of spades, then he's probably going to call the river very often. He doesn't believe us having a king here, or he might have king himself. So when you broke the turn and board pairs, and the opponent calls, then you should be quite cautious on the river, because if you just bet the turn and he calls, probably we can let's barrel the river, then you end up losing probably more than you win. So be cautious. Button opens, king then 9-8. Defend, sort of marginal, and pair an open-ender. Nice hand. Let's start by checking. Opponent checks back. And now the board is rainbow, but Jack 9 allows so many straight draws that strong hands like Ace Jack would bet often, sets would bet often. We are blocking the kings, aces, try queens. Rainbow board they often bet, not sure, but could have those. But I would assume most 2 pairs would bet here. And with the 9 we block a lot of those. So now once again the top card pairs. And now we have pretty nice blockers because we are blocking the backdoor flush draw. And then we are blocking the straight draws with the 10 and 8. So it's really hard for opponent to have a strong hand here. Like his range is pretty much capped to over pairs. You could have a jack, but most of his range is over pair, over cards, or even total air or 7-8 type of hands, 10-7. Really weak hands. So if we think that okay, we have a draw, let's check, would be nice to see the river. Then I think it goes wrong because we have huge falling equity here. If he calls, then probably his calling range is like over pairs or flush draws or whatever. We have equity versus that. So very good spot to bet the turn. Represent the jack, definitely makes sense. And he just folds. So a good spot to semi-bluff. Fourth hand is 8-7-6-5. And kind of opens, defend from the big blind. And we flopped bottom 2 with open-ender. Plan is to check call, but he decides to check back. And now kind of 1 high 2 low cards. Spot where people often cbet. overpairs, good c-bet, high flush draws. Checking back this flop, often what I would say, wouldn't be surprised to see try overpair, try flush draw type of hand. And then the jack pairs like in the previous hand. And now we have bottom two pairs and we have open ender. Now we don't have any flush blockers. So the chance of him having a flush draw goes up a little. Decide to bet the turn. And now the plan is if he calls and river is a blank, that doesn't help us. There aren't many though of those. Then would be a good spot to barrel and put a lot of pressure to pocket 10s, pocket 9s, pocket queens. Who knows? But definitely a good spot to bet instead of giving him a free river. And if he folds hand like pocket 9s here, he's folding the best hand. So I think it's a good spot to bet. Once again, if he raises, we definitely fold. Then he has a jack. But the chance of him having a jack goes down a lot when the board top card pairs and he doesn't c-bet the flop. And then the last one, pocket kings. UTG opens, we call, and we flop top pair, overpair with the king of clubs blocker. Most likely the plan here was to check raise, because we have really good blockers to his calling range. We are blocking sets and two pairs and flushes. But he decides to check back, and now, when people check back monotone boards, the question is what he c-bets on monotones, how often he c-bets. If people bet small with most of their air, then the check back often means pair, weak two pairs, straight draw type of hand, top pair, overpair, definitely something. Then is kind of black. It completes 8-9 for the straight. We have the 8. And we do have the king blocker. We do have the top card blocker. Plan was to check raise the flop. Probably nothing changes on the turn. So we're propending the turn, representing king high flush. If he calls, river doesn't pair the board, fire the river and make him fold two pairs or sets. I mean, now for the set, it becomes a bit harder to call because the straight is there. But he decides to fold here, no need to barrel the river. I mean, often I see people here trying to check raise the turn. There's two problems in trying to check raise the turn with the king or even ace blocker here. One is that when opponent checks back the flop, he's often checking back the turn. And then on the river, the only way to bluff is to bet the river. And often you don't have that much fold equity when you bet the river because it's the final bet. Opponent knows that I can go to showdown for paying this one bet. When you bet the turn, you have leverage because you threat the opponent, okay, you have to call this one and I am going to fire the river. You have to call another big bet. So you have more leverage when you bet the turn, but on the river, it's your final bet. People call with wider range and more easily. Second, if you check the flop and check raise turn, that smells. I mean, in reality, if you had a king high flush here, how often you would go for check raise? So often check flop, check raise turn, or check flop, check turn, check raise river. I would say that from my experience, that is way more often a blocker bluff than the nut flush. Because if people have a high flush, they want to start to build up the point, they want to get the value, and they will bet the turn very often. So it doesn't matter how well you represent your flush if in reality you don't play your flushes that way, or the majority of player who doesn't play flushes that way. So I like to bet the turn here. All right. Kind of video, not too much instant strategies that you can follow. I don't think we have a lot of those in PLO, but more about if the video made you think about prop betting, and next time when you are playing and opponent checks back the flop, you remember that, okay, these are the things we should be thinking about here, and you start to think about poker with slightly higher level than just my cards versus the board. That's what's improving you as a poker player. And in prop betting, you really have to think about ranges and how actions define both of your ranges and what's going to happen on the river if I bet the turn and he calls and so on. So prop betting spots are good for learning too, because you have to think about a lot of concepts and things that will make you a really good poker player. So hope you enjoyed this one about when should we prop bet. This time all of the prop bets were pretty much bluffs. I think value betting, prop value betting turn without readers is easy. If you have a value hand, you bet. It's a bit easier. The bluffing is the one that requires a bit more about thinking estimations and understanding stuff. I hope you enjoyed. Thank you for watching, and I will see you on the next video. Stay safe in the galaxy.